I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to YIVO. I understand that many of you have come from out of town, from Los Angeles, from Florida, possibly even from New Jersey. Thank you all for coming. If there are any people in the audience who are not at this point recognized as part of the OTC group, but who have had relatives who were in that group, I invite you to stand up and be recognized as part of this. Thank you very much. It's a deeply meaningful event, obviously, for all of us in this room. It's very meaningful for the YIVO Institute, because today what we're celebrating is a bigger story than perhaps many of us recognize. There are at least three different narratives here. There is the narrative of those who were rescued. There is the narrative of the rescuers and all that they went through in order to accomplish this. And there is a third story that is only possible, it's only been made possible because of the generosity of the OTC organization in donating this archive, their archive, to the YIVO Institute. Because by virtue of putting all of these different stories, all these narratives together in one place, we're now able to tell as much of a coherent and connected account as is possible. And this is only the result of bringing these fragments together into one place. And that's what the YIVO Institute is. We are the place where innumerable fragments of the Jewish experience before, during, and after the Holocaust find a home. And so YIVO is a place where this larger story, this third story, can be constructed. It is a story that we really don't know all the details of. And the experiences of OTC are an excellent example precisely of that, of an undiscovered story that has come to light only recently. And by virtue of putting it into our archive, we have this narrative in connection with the vast narrative of Hayas, with the vast narrative of the pogroms, with the vast narrative of the Warsaw Ghetto, and all of the other narratives that we have. I invite you all to come to YIVO, to research, to learn about your own family histories, to learn about the history of the Jewish family, of which we're all a part. We're proud today to have the opportunity to discuss the story behind this collection and to bring to light this previously little-known story about Holocaust rescue and activities in the United States. The OTC collection at YIVO includes some of the world's most significant documentation on the subject, and its rich collection includes hundreds of memoirs, articles, lectures, videos, case files, and photographs. I invite you to become a member of YIVO. We have a table in the hall where you can pick up some literature about this organization, about our activities, our educational activities, our research activities, our outreach activities, and you can become a member and help support our activities in general. I would like to thank the 1,000 Children Not-for-Profit Organization, specifically Iris Posner, co-founder of OTC, Henry Frankel, current president of OTC, Larry Hahn and Kurt Kleinman, and the OTC board for working with us on this program. And I want to stress that creating this organization and creating this archive was not a foregone conclusion. It wasn't an automatic or mechanical thing that one does. It took vision. It took a lot of hard work. It took an understanding of the importance of this whole effort as a whole. And so all of these people deserve our greatest gratitude. I want to thank the YIVO staff, Suzanne Leon, Alex Brandwine, Helena Gindi, for preparing today's event in conjunction with the OTC organization. And of course, I want to thank Alliance Bernstein for sponsoring the reception following the program. We are very grateful for their support, for your support. I would now like to introduce Henry Frankel, current president of OTC, who will make a few remarks. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helene Frankel, wife of Henry Frankel, and also a member of the OTC board. Now it is my honor to present some biographical material about Iris Posner. Iris Posner is President Emeritus and co-founder with Lenore Moskowitz of 1,000 Children, otherwise known as OTC, a nonprofit research and educational organization dedicated to the history of unaccompanied children rescued from the Holocaust by private American organizations and individuals. After graduating from the Mount Sinai Hospital School of Nursing in New York, Ms. Posner completed a BS in nursing and postgraduate work in social psychology at Columbia University and a master's in public administration from Baruch College. Prior to assuming the presidency of OTC, Ms. Posner conducted social science research at the National Institute of Health and Social Security Administration. She held positions as health program analyst at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Deputy Associate Director of Health Budget Planning in the Office of Management and Budget of the City of New York. In the nonprofit sector, Ms. Posner held positions in business development and strategic planning at the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. Her work in the private sector included Director of Strategic Planning and Communications at Corporate Health Strategies, a subsidiary of the MetLife Insurance Company, and communications consultant at Bell Atlantic. Under her leadership, from its founding in 2000 through 2007, OTC identified the names of virtually all the rescued unaccompanied children, found more than 500 of these children, located and communicated with rescuers and second and third generation children in the OTC family, collected a unique and extensive multimedia archive, collaborated with researchers to design and conduct scholarly studies and papers, as well as with museums to develop exhibitions in the U.S. and abroad related to the OTC rescue and resettlement history. The organization acted as a consultant in the creation of a documentary about the OTC rescues and planned and carried out a 3-day conference of presentations by scholars, researchers, OTC children, their children, and rescuers. The conference included a reunion of over 200 members of the OTC family. OTC promoted and supported local OTC groups, designed and maintained an OTC website, 1000children.org, and generated national and international coverage in periodicals, newspapers, and television. Ms. Posner co-edited with Philip Jason, the first and only book of memoirs of the children and rescuers called Don't Wave Goodbye, which now resides in universities, museums, and libraries worldwide. In 2008, Ms. Posner and Ms. Moskowitz resigned their positions in OTC as president and vice president, respectively. Ms. Posner has continued in a consulting capacity to OTC, providing information and advice in support of organizational goals and activities. Ms. Posner, who also holds certificates in film production and printmaking, is currently making art. And now it's Henry Frankel.
It is with a great deal of pleasure that I present to you my mentor, guide, and colleague, Iris Posner. Without her insight and hard work, there would not have been an OTC. And it has been through her help that the OTC story has spread and flourished.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for those introductions. The title of my presentation is American Rescue of Children of the Holocaust, a Network of Resistance and Cooperation. Haskell Taylor survived 2 concentration camps, lost his wife and most of his family. His 2 young children survived. They were sent to America and placed with foster parents. Manfred and Camila were part of a relatively unknown rescue and resettlement operation that spanned oceans, operated for more than a decade, was made possible by a network of cooperation among private organizations and individuals. After the war, Haskell remarried, had a 3rd child, Judith, and immigrated to Israel. Judith, now Judith Baumel Schwartz, a scholar of Jewish history and the Holocaust, holds several prestigious positions at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Our paths crossed in 2000 and changed my life. Due to the size of the operation and press coverage, historians have long known about Britain's rescue of 10,000 unaccompanied children during the Holocaust, known as the Kindertransports, a rescue and resettlement operation significantly different from that which brought unaccompanied children to America, who have become known as the 1,000 children. In 2000, the story of the Kindertransports, recounted in a documentary, raised a question for me. What had America done to rescue children during the Holocaust? An answer was in the book, Unfulfilled Promise, Rescue and Resettlement of Jewish Refugee Children in the United States, 1934 to 1945. Its author was Judith Baumel. The operation that saved her brother and sister became the subject of her PhD thesis and a subsequent book, published by Denali Press. Its owner and editor, Alan Shaw, amazingly, was one of my childhood friends and classmates in the Bronx. The book was the first and is still the only complete history of rescue and resettlement of the 1,000 children. Baumel's research confirmed, without any doubt, that from 1933 to 1945, there was a network of cooperation based on written and informal agreements, personal relationships, interlocking boards, memoranda of understanding, and contracts between private groups and with government entities, whose work resulted in the transport to America of approximately 1,200 unaccompanied, mostly Jewish children. I thought someone should make a record of all their names. I proposed the project to my oldest friend, Lenore Moskowitz. For Lenore and myself, what began as a seemingly simple task became a 7-year commitment, and for me, a full-time endeavor. With Judith Baumel-Schwartz, our historian consultant, and the help of other fellow unpaid volunteers, including ex-Red Cross tracer Adriana Sandler, an organization was formed to research this history and make it available to the public, to academia, and to OTC children and their families. First, some definitions. What is an OTC child? An OTC child is a child generally below the age of 16 of Jewish background, including non-Aryan Christian children considered Jewish by the Nazis, in danger due to persecution sent by their family from foreign countries to the United States, to be placed with relatives or foster families until they could be reunited with their families. The rescue and resettlement was usually arranged through the efforts, auspices, and funding provided by private organizations and individuals in America and elsewhere. OTC rescuers include formal organizations, sectarian and non-sectarian, funders, organizations and individuals, foster families, and individuals including ship and escape route escorts, and persons providing shelter to OTC children in cities and points of embarkation. In 1933, with persecution of Jews rising in Germany, Jewish groups met to devise a plan to bring Jewish children from Germany to America. Given restrictive immigration laws, economic pressure of the Depression, isolationist and anti-foreigner sentiment, and persistent and growing anti-Semitism, they reasoned Americans would be sympathetic to children and would not be seen as competitors for jobs. Also, American regulations would allow the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, to accept bonds for unaccompanied children. A proposal was brought to the government by representatives of Jewish organizations and interested persons. It was agreed that a privately funded organization could bring 250 Jewish children to the United States under the German immigration quota. It would post a bond of $500 for each child, preventing them from becoming public charges, arrange for their transport, and care for them after arrival. In addition to laws controlling immigration, quotas, bonds, and affidavits, additional requirements relating to resettlement included placement of Jewish children only with Jewish families, which was not the case with the British Kindertransports, and placement in homes meeting minimum standards, including no more than 2 children to a room. Also, foster families had to be committed to seeing that the child was educated, would not become a public charge, and would, if necessary, assume their care until age 21. Local social workers would be assigned to oversee the resettlement and progress of each child. These laws and regulations economically press families and are required by the requirement of the Department of State a low profile regarding press and fundraising. All these things made it exceedingly difficult to find and obtain support for acceptable families and homes. The organization formed to implement the operation, the German Jewish Children's Aid, was committed to operating within the law and abiding by all government regulations, for fear of providing those opposed to its goals with a basis to call for an end of its operations. The German Jewish Children's Aid was an umbrella organization founded by organizations you probably know: the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, the B'nai B'rith, the National Council of Jewish Women, HIAS, the American Joint Distribution Committee known as the Joint, the National Conference of Jewish Social Workers, and the Committee on German-Jewish Immigration Policy. A document announcing formation of this organization was quietly circulated to relevant organizations, asking for donations to transport the children to the United States and the names of families willing to accept refugee children. It ends with a stern instruction to carry out this work with no publicity. At the center of child rescue operations was Cecilia Rozovsky, also called CR, a social worker experienced in immigration and refugee resettlement and having contacts in the United States as well as abroad. CR simultaneously held leadership positions in multiple organizations involved in the rescue and resettlement of children and adult refugees, and became the director of the German Jewish Children's Aid, later known as the European Jewish Children's Aid. Her work in refugee and immigration affairs is described in Cecilia Rozovsky, an American Jewish Women's Rescue Operations in World War II, by Bat Ami Zucker. The director of placement for the German Jewish Children's Aid was Lottie Marcuse, also a social worker, who was responsible for the placement of each child and was a major figure in the OTC history. She often met the ships at the dock and is remembered very fondly by many of the children we interviewed. In the United States, between 34 and 45, dozens of national organizations were involved in the transfer and resettlement of European refugees. A small number focused on children, but all generally maintained contact with each other and formed a network with many formal and informal connections, relationships, and shared as well as distributed responsibilities. Together, they all constituted a non-governmental, American-based network that conducted active resistance to Nazism. Among U.S. groups participating in the network of cooperation to rescue children was the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, the National Coordinating Committee, the Unitarian Committee, the National Refugee Service, the U.S. Committee for the Care of Refugee Children, the American OZE, and the U.S. Children's Bureau. All non-governmental except for the Bureau, which sets standards for the care of child refugees. Among famous names associated with these organizations were Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein. Less famous was Martha and Waitzel Sharp of the Unitarian Group. For 2 years, beginning in 1939, the Sharps, leaving their own children, made multiple and dangerous trips to Europe, often one step ahead of the Gestapo. Working with others in the network, they arranged for the transport and escorted to America many at-risk adults and over 25 unaccompanied children. For their work, Yad Vashem recognized them as righteous among the nations. U.S. organizations involved in child rescues had counterparts around the world, including Germany and Austria. In southern France, OSE, supported by the Joint, sheltered Jewish children in chateaus. When Vichy fell, over 250 of these children were brought to America in 3 groups and placed in foster homes. These were the single largest OTC groups, with 2 transports of children, each numbering over 100. In 1934 in Berlin, Rozovsky's counterparts were receiving requests from parents wanting to send their children out of harm's way. Kate Rosenheim, director of the Children's Immigration Department of the Central Organization of Jews in Germany, coordinated with organizations worldwide. Rozovsky visited Rosenheim in Germany multiple times, as well as others throughout Europe, working out a system of cooperation. She continued to travel to Europe after the war actually started and was badly injured when a bomb landed near the Jeep in which she was traveling. Returning home, she continued communicating with organizations worldwide to support, expand, and help manage the network that she and others had built. Not surprisingly, among network participants, there were instances of counterproductive personal rivalries, resentments, and intrigues. After studying this maze of organizations with multiple ties and levels of communications, Dr. Baumel-Schwartz explains, only by understanding this ponderous machinery, and I would add politics, of rescue and resettlement, can one begin to comprehend the difficulty of implementing any child rescue scheme. On November 9, 1934, after over a year of planning and negotiations with the Department of Labor, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the U.S. Children's Bureau, the first group of 9 children, boys aged 11 to 14, arrived in New York. They were brought to foster homes in and around New York City. Later, OTC children were placed with families across America. It would cost about $500 yearly per child to maintain rescued children in foster homes that required subsidization, which many did. A second group of 9 arrived November 11, 1934, with 3 girls. The third group, which arrived on the 24th of November, had more girls, and so it increased until in some groups girls outnumbered boys. A total of 53 children arrived in just 2 months of 1934. Rescues of boys and girls would continue to the extent allowed by government, available funds, acceptable families, and events related to the progress of the war. In 1935, as conditions worsened, Rozovsky was receiving calls reporting that European relatives were saying that they could no longer even buy bread for their children. The pressure on those working in Europe was even worse. Rozovsky wrote, "Social workers can work in their offices only a certain length of time before they break down. You do not know what it means when an American comes in from the outside and shows them what is being done in an effort to help them. At least they realize we have not forgotten them." 1938 was a turning point for organizations and persons concerned with Jewish children in Europe. 5 weeks after Kristallnacht, the British began the Kindertransports, and in the 9 subsequent months brought 10,000 mostly Jewish unaccompanied children to England. They were placed with Jewish and Christian families, and more than half were in group homes. At the time of the British Kindertransports, OTC, since 1934, had rescued about 400 children. In 1939, a resolution by Senator Robert Wagner and Representative Edith Rogers proposed admission into the United States of 20,000 children from Germany over and above the existing quota. During the hearings, many spoke in favor of the bill. Eleanor Roosevelt worked to rally support. Those opposed, however, succeeded in significantly amending the bill, which resulted in its withdrawal by sponsors. President Roosevelt never publicly backed it. European parents were desperate. Rozovsky wrote, "We are getting thousands of inquiries about children. We not only are not taking large groups, but we are even slowing up on those whom we have agreed to take because of the long delays in the quota. We get people coming in all day scolding us. At the end of the day, we are spent physically and mentally." Rescuing organizations were deeply concerned with the number and pace of children being rescued, especially after Kristallnacht, and they pressed for an increase in available visas, but to no avail. While most of the OTC children were rescued by a network of cooperating organizations, some were rescued through family-to-family arrangements or by private groups, such as Bris Shalom, which you will hear a lot more about this afternoon. This organization obtained 50 visas from the government for unaccompanied children, which members selected and escorted to America. Although not the only nor largest group of unaccompanied children rescued and brought to America, this personal commitment is an example for us all. Interestingly, there is a connection between those rescues and the network of cooperation. A 1942 memo by the German Jewish Children's Aid Director of Placement, Lottie Marcuse, reports that a representative of Bris Shalom asked the German Jewish Children's Aid to take over responsibility for service and support of cases involving seven children due to placement and monetary issues. Marcuse asked the representative to put his request in writing and told him she would gladly submit it for action. In such ways did the network assist organizations, individuals, and operations outside its direct sponsorship and administration. In 1939, in addition to the 50 Bris Shalom rescued children, the network also rescued 45 children for a total that year of 95. Rescue figures for other years were 125 in 1940, 286 in 41, 106 in 42, 137 in 43, 39 in 44, and amazingly even 20 in 1945. By the 1940s in Berlin, parents queued up for days in lines blocks long to talk to someone at the Jewish agency about getting their children out of Europe. The staff, which often worked through the night, had to call in the police to protect them from the desperate crowds that had overrun their small offices. In 1941 and 42, Nazi roundups of children began. The situation was so desperate that the president of the National Council of Jewish Women wrote to sister organizations, "Grave emergency due to wholesale massacre, threatened extermination of Jewish children in Europe makes it important we meet at once. We are calling a special meeting of the National Jewish Organizations." Among the heroic figures in OTC history are the parents who painfully sent their children to America. Howard Riggins, working with the Quaker organization in Spain and Portugal, related, quote, "Several heads of family came in to talk to me about this terrible decision. And one woman asked, 'We have already lost so much. Must we now give up our own children?' In 1939, the American Friends Service Committee had agreed to provide services to the German Jewish Children's Aid as negotiators between German government officials and Jewish organizations. And in 1941, it provided staff in Europe to directly handle rescue operations where it was no longer possible for Jewish organizations to operate openly. In his studies on non-Aryan Christian refugees from Nazism, historian Chaim Ganinzi found that many non-sectarian rescue groups were so in name only, being mostly comprised of members and clients who were actually Jewish. This allowed for the rescue of non-Aryan Christian children by Jewish groups and provided cover for them against anti-Semitic and anti-immigration forces in the United States. Initially, children were brought from Germany. By war's end, children had arrived from many countries, including England, and were of many ethnic backgrounds. Over the years, the routes taken changed, first coming directly by ship from Germany to the United States and to the East Coast. As transportation routes closed, points of embarkation and disembarkation changed, with children coming to the U.S. via Spain, Portugal, Italy, Sweden, and Holland. Some came via Siberia and Japan and landed in San Francisco. As for the bureaucratic process of rescue, for children in Germany, it was determined by officers in Berlin. After German takeover, similar processes were carried out in Vienna and Prague. Children were chosen by local Jewish agencies. In France, they were chosen by the Quakers and brought out through Spain and Portugal. What all these processes shared was a monumental pile of required paperwork that at times brought the rescue to a complete halt. In 1934, children arrived ready to begin an adventure. Later, children arrived traumatized and ill. After necessary treatment, they were transported to their foster families, whose members and homes had been investigated by local child welfare agencies. Despite attempts to match children and families, in some cases, changes had to be made, and this was overseen by social workers assigned to each child. Once settled, children began school and studied English. Concerned about their families in Europe, some children successfully prevailed upon foster families to sponsor a family member. A majority of the OTC children lost one or both parents, as well as extended family members. Most remained in the United States. Many OTC children developed strong ties to their foster families, introducing their own children to them as family. Most OTC children learned English quickly, succeeded in school, and many moved ahead multiple grades within a short time. A Harvard study of child refugees to the United States during the Holocaust, which included over 200 OTC children, showed that the OTC cohort was resilient and as a group attained educational and career success significantly beyond comparable American and American-born Jewish groups. Among them is a Nobel Prize winner, a rock and roll impresario, an ambassador, an assistant secretary for defense, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, teachers, writers, and poets. Many of the boys and some of the girls joined the armed forces during the war. In short, they became proud and productive citizens of their adopted country. I leave you with the still relevant words of Bishop Shell of Chicago, an attendee at a 1941 network fundraiser at the Waldorf Astoria. There is need of kindness if changes are to be wrought in the world today. The rescue of people in need, especially children, is the kind of work needed. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Please come up. Have a seat. So I will begin introductions from the left and come this way. It's such a great pleasure to have Debórah Dwork on our stage again. Debórah is both an old friend, a comrade from Yale University Press days, as well as one of the most distinguished Holocaust historians in the world. Her specialization is the fate of children. Debórah is the Rose Professor of Holocaust History and Director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. She is a leading authority on university education and Holocaust and genocide education. Debórah has been inter alia a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, a member of the U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, formerly ITF. Professor Dwork serves on numerous advisory boards and works with nonprofit organizations and foundations concerning Holocaust education. She has written numerous award-winning books, including Auschwitz, Flight from the Reich, Jewish Refugees, 1933-1946, and most recently, A Boy in Terezin, The Private Diary of Pavel Weiner. Seated next to Professor Dwork is Erwin Tepper, a rescued child who was born in Vienna, Austria. In 1939, 1 year after Germany annexed Austria, Mr. Tepper was brought to America as part of the rescue effort. Erwin earned a BS from Yale University and an MD from the University of Basel in Switzerland. He went on to serve as attending radiologist in radiation oncology at Albert Einstein School of Medicine of Yeshiva University in New York and radiation oncologist at Monmouth Medical Center in New Jersey. Erwin retired from Monmouth Medical Center in 1994. It's a great pleasure to have you. Seated next to Erwin is Iris Posner, who has already been introduced. Thank you for joining us, Iris. And our last guest is Yves Boden, also a rescued child, who was born in Mannheim, Germany, and in 1942, at the age of 7, was brought to the United States unaccompanied as part of the rescue effort. She received her BS degree from NYU and Master of Social Work from the Wurlitzer School of Social Work, Yeshiva University. Yves has worked extensively with cancer patients and their families, and today practices psychotherapy with a more varied population. Thank you all for joining. I will be moderating today's discussion that will last about a half an hour or so, and I hope we can get into some important issues. But what is uppermost on my mind, as Iris, I heard your presentation, was on the one hand how wonderful it is that 1,200 children were rescued, and on the other hand, how pathetic, how small an effort. Not in terms of the effort of individuals, but perhaps the overall effort to raise children, to rescue children. It's something that I think haunts all of us. It certainly is a subject of great debate and consternation and anger still, and bewilderment. And I wonder if we could start by talking a little bit about general conditions of the time. Debórah, maybe you have something to contribute.
Oh gosh, I have a whole semester worth to answer on that, but I will be brief. I assume that we don't need to do anything to the mic for it to work? Okay, so I'm a professor. Even though Jonathan asked the question, you're the audience, so I'm looking at you. Is that all right with you? Okay. I understand exactly what Jonathan is saying. Only 1,000, we could have done so much more. We all know that. From my perspective, knowing the conditions at the time, I am amazed that this group managed to do as much as it did. So very briefly, follow me on this one. As the Germans gained land, they got, as they gobbled up different countries, they got land they wanted and Jews they didn't. So the question was, where were those Jews going to flee to? Add another layer of complication, a maze of contradictions. On the one hand, Jews couldn't go to countries to get a job. On the other hand, they could not apply for jobs in advance in nearly most professions. Add to that the complications of visas, of quota numbers, of exit visas from Greater Germany, transit visas, ship cards, train passes, all of that. So I will stop, but Jonathan, you are of course 100% right. We could have done so much more, but how amazing. Sidebar, everybody, if ever we were in a situation of having to get ourselves to safety, I urge every single person here, don't even bother doing it legally. Much more direct to just flee over the green border.
Mm-hmm. Iris, I was fascinated by what you said. The last instruction that went out to foster parents was say nothing about this. Do it with the least amount of publicity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about conditions in the United States and the difficulties of working through the American bureaucracy at that time.
Yeah, you're referring actually to instructions that were given to the organizations which the German Jewish Children's Aid was from whom they were trying to raise funds, and also to obtain names of families that would take refugee children. Well, the instruction initially for keeping things very quiet came actually directly as part of the package agreement that was made with the Department of State. One of the requirements when German Jewish Children's Aid was formed was that they would operate relatively quietly. I mean, they were told that directly by the government.
And why?
Why?
Why was it necessary? Talk a little bit about the level of anti-Semitism in this country.
Oh, I really think Debórah could probably address that better. But my own reading of the literature, and please feel free to chime in on this, is that the 30s and 40s was probably the height of anti-Semitism in America. And it was into this environment that Jews who were established in America were trying to push America to do something it didn't want to do. Most of the Jews had been here quite a while, and they had established lives, and they were not, initially, Jews who were already American citizens were not so much the object of overt anti-Semitism, but the immigrants themselves became a new target for anti-Semitism because they represented not only their religion, but they represented immigrants and refugees, and there was a tremendous animosity against bringing in immigrants into the United States. In some ways, there is tremendous parallels even today.
So, Debórah, I wonder if you could add to that a little bit. Also, what I wonder about is, was there resistance from the Jewish population to raising the level of concern?
There was a wide spectrum of response by the Jewish community, and from those who were, like Hillel Kook, who were absolutely adamant that we must do as much as we can to aid our European brethren, come what may, do it. And there were huge rallies in Madison.
And what did he represent? What sort of spectrum politically did he represent?
He represented the left part of the spectrum, no question, no question about it. Huge rallies in Madison Square Garden, no question. On the other end of the spectrum was more conservative, more established Jewish figures who worried greatly about increased anti-Semitism because of exhortations and treaties to the U.S. government on behalf of Jews in Europe. Sidebar there, just to put you in the picture, to remind you about this. Anyone who was looking, for example, at hotels outside of Berlin or hotels in the countryside outside of New York in the early 1930s, 1930, 1931, 1932, would have predicted some kind of major anti-Semitic action here, not there.
I'd like to add one thing, a kind of a personal reminiscence of how what the effect of anti-Semitism was. My dad, during the war, got a job with IBM, and he took off Yom Kippur, and shortly after that, he lost his job. He was let go. So Jews were very well aware of their position in American society at that time.
So it was not a small thing that Sandy Koufax refused to pitch on Yom Kippur. Erwin and Eve, I wonder if you could contribute to this a little bit in terms of your own experience after you got here in terms of understanding the social conditions in America. Did you experience any overt anti-Semitism or resistance, or What was the quality of your experience like when you got here?
Well, I must admit I didn't really feel any overt after I was one of the Brit Shalom children, and we spent the summer at the Brit Shalom camp, which was all Jewish and all that. And I was taken in by an aunt living in the Bronx. And the neighborhood was fairly, maybe 25-30% Jewish. It was near Montefiore Hospital, if you people know that general area, and the upper part of Jerome Avenue. I mean, every other store was either a kosher deli or something of that nature. So I didn't really feel that much at that particular time, except the language. I couldn't speak English too well. And as I said, we lived in a walk-up, I think 3 or 4, 5 flights. And then we played in a little bit of a backyard, and there were other children there, and they would yell out, you know, Mommy, to come to the window. And I would yell out, Tante, come to the window. And the other kids would laugh at me. So finally I decided, I'm going to call up Mommy. And boy, did I get it from my aunt. I'm not your mother's coming, you know, don't forget her, etc., etc. That's about the closest thing I can remember. Then we moved to Bridgeport, and again, it was a relatively quiet Jewish community, and there was some bullying going on, but at that time, I didn't realize it. When they were bullying me, I told them, you lay a hand on me and I'll beat the hell out of you. Of course, I couldn't. But it was enough. I got away with it.
Very good.
Well, I was very young.
Yes? It's working.
So I probably wasn't very aware of overt anti-Semitism until I got, when I was in Pleasantville Cottage School. I was 11, from 11 to 15, I was there. And when I went to Pleasantville High School, I was one of a bunch of kids from the cottage. I was one of very few kids from the cottage school, but there was this Jewish foster institution in the midst of a very waspy environment called Pleasantville. And I was one of the few kids who went to the outside high school. And I had to be All-American, and I was on the field hockey team. But I had only hand-me-downs to wear. I didn't have a whole lot of clothes, and everybody had penny loafers except me. I had these funky, fun, strange shoes, and I was dressed very differently, and I was very aware. I mean, that even when I was on the playing field, I was I stood out as one of those kids, one of those cottage school kids, and it was sub rosa, but it was very clearly there. I was very different, because by then I spoke English.
How long did it take you to learn English?
Well, I came here when I was 7, and when I was 8, I spoke 3 languages. By the time I was 8 and a half, I only spoke English, period. My initial difficulty with the letter R in English, because I would keep pronouncing it as a W, so I would say, I don't even remember what I would say, but I lost everything, my accent, my language skills, by the time I was 8 and a half. I think the first, when I started school, I think the first 3 or 4 months I really struggled because I didn't understand English. And by January or February, I was like, okay. So it took 3 or 4 months as a 7-year-old.
Were you ever reunited with your family members?
No, I was an only child. My parents were sent to Auschwitz. I did have relatives. My father's family was totally obliterated. My mother had a sister and 2 brothers. One brother went to Palestine, one brother came to New York, and one sister went to Argentina. So I was sent to live with my uncle who was in New York. where I stayed for a month, and then I started a whole series of foster homes after that.
Erwin, your after-war experience?
Well, as far as growing up and so on, obviously when I got to the Bronx, I couldn't speak English too well, even though at the camp, the most important thing, from the day we got on the boat, we had English lessons, all 50 of us. And that continued almost every day at the camp outside of Philadelphia. So my English was limited. I had finished, almost finished second grade in Europe. I could read, write. Of course, if you look at my signature on my passport, you would never know it says Erwin Tepper, because the script is entirely different. But I got to the Bronx, September. I went to the local school. What did they do? You can't speak English? I started out in kindergarten. I was the oldest child in kindergarten. I was 7. I was also the tallest. Of course, that gave me the honor of putting the star on the Christmas tree. That was all right. But I will admit I was sort of skipped every now and then we moved to Bridgeport. And in Bridgeport, I remember going to the local school, and the principal, my mother and I went to the principal's office, and the principal gave me a book to read, a paragraph or two, and I read it. And I guess my English was reasonably well by then. He asked me to explain it, and I gave him some explanation. Wait here, he says. Brought in another young man, obviously, read the same paragraph, asked him the same questions, got almost the same answers, and he said, okay, you're in 3rd grade, which is where I was supposed to be. So now, because of the way the birthdays went in Connecticut, I guess, where I was the oldest child in kindergarten, I was one of the youngest children in grade 3 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And the fascinating thing, quickie, the child that he brought in to sort of test me was a young man by the name of Arthur Yakubovich, who became a Orthodox rabbi. And we've been friends since 3rd grade. And he had an interesting, went into the Army after he got his degree. He was stationed, would you believe, in Alaska. I think there were 5 Jews in all of Alaska, and he was their rabbi.
One of the things, as I gathered from our conversations in the past, and I think, Iris, you touched on this, is that the children in this effort didn't know each other. And they were not aware that they were part of this larger story.
That's true.
It's a very, very interesting fact, it seems to me, about the sociology of this particular history. And was that intentional on the part of the organizers? And could you explain a little bit of the circumstances of people like Frances Perkins and Cecilia Rozovsky? And
it was absolutely intentional, and because both the government officials and the Jewish organizations felt that more than 2 Jews in one place is a cabal, right? So they purposely decided...
At least 3 opinions, yes.
...to disperse the children so that, at first, as I mentioned, a number were in New York City. And that was only initially, I think, just because it was easy to do. But soon the policy was that they would be dispersed, and they went to about 100 major cities from coast to coast, north and south. And so many of the children, some of the children actually came one at a time. They had no idea whatsoever that it was anyone else under similar circumstances. And then they were placed in a family where there were just none other of the children as well. At the reunion in 2002, thank you, seems so long ago, the children were able to get together for the first time since they were on the ships together, and also learn about the experience of all of the others. And it was an absolute revelation, I think.
Absolutely.
And some people were just totally speechless over the entire thing. But it meant, I've come to find out, because some have told me, that this has become that event and the knowledge, even for those who are not part of the event, that knowledge has become extremely important in their life, that it actually changed their lives, that it changed how they felt about themselves, and that some of the children even started telling their own histories to their own children where previously they had not done that.
Eve, were you going to say something?
Well, what I was going to say is that I think my life changed. I'm a member of another organization called the Hidden Children. And prior to 1991, when that first conference was held, I had fallen between the cracks as far as my identity went. I wasn't from the Bronx, I wasn't from Brooklyn, and I certainly didn't consider myself a survivor. So I gained an identity at that conference that was part of a large, very large.
You were a survivor.
Yeah, but I didn't consider myself one. I hadn't been in camps. My parents had died in Auschwitz, but that didn't make me a survivor of the horrible, horrendous, unspeakable experiences. So at that point, I really gained an identity, and my husband says to many people, now she talks about it. And it's true, because prior to that, I mean, I'd spoken to my children. It wasn't a situation that I kept hidden, but I didn't speak freely about it, and I wasn't nearly as open. And then when I learned about 1,000 Children, I was like, yeah, there are really other people like me. Isn't that amazing? Holy, I never met anybody. So, yes, it's a very important piece of one's history, because I had nobody to really give me that part of my history.
So, Iris, did you have any idea that you were going to be unlocking all of these things when you started?
No, and Lenore and I often talk about, what it took in retrospect, and I opine, if I knew what it was going to take, and that it was going to take 7 years, I don't know that I would have done it. It has been an absolute honor for us to have been able to do this. Somehow it was brought to our door, and we accepted the challenge. But it has really been our honor to do it, and we will, cherish that opportunity and the friends we've made along the way, and how much we've learned and appreciate our own lives because we've learned these stories.
Debórah, I wonder. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you talk about meeting other children at that point. I'll tell you a quick, wild story. As I said, I went to the Bronx. From the Bronx, I moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut. And in Connecticut, we had a nice life, and we had a family doctor, which I went to the office fairly often. I broke my arm, I broke my wrist. And in that office, the doctor I knew was from Vienna. He was an immigrant from Vienna, and he spoke with a bit of an accent. And then I noticed that every now and then there would be a young girl helping out, out in the office, and she spoke with a bit of an accent. And I figured, all right, that's his daughter. Fine. It turns out that, and I didn't find this out until 2002 when I met this individual that I'm going to tell you about. This lady, or this young girl, had a brother, a younger brother. Those two were with me on the boat. It was one of the 50 children. The doctor, who was my family doctor, was a cousin of theirs. And he had taken them in. And I never met the brother because they went to they were in different ends of Bridgewater. I was in the north end, they were in the south end. They went to different schools, et cetera, et cetera. And I never met the brother until a reunion, sort of at the Brit Shalom office in Philadelphia, a few months before the 2000 reunion in Chicago. And you will see him in the movie this afternoon. But I never even knew that he existed until, well, 1939 to 2002. And yet I had been to his house innumerable times because, you know, you had doctor's office in the bottom and the home up on top.
So in a way, the history was also hidden from yourselves.
Well, I don't know if it was hidden. I knew I was one of the 50 children. I knew I was born in Vienna, period.
Right, but you didn't know the compass of it.
No.
Yes, and Debórah, I wanted to ask you, I know you have something you want to add now, but I want, if you would, come back. The Kindertransport is very famous. And I wonder if you could compare and contrast it a little bit with this effort, to the extent to which it was let us say, more centrally organized, there was more understanding of among the people who were doing it and so on and so forth, but then go on with the comment you wanted to make.
The comment that I wanted to make was actually about how your lives are threads in this broader weave of history. But you didn't know it, you didn't see it until the pattern became clearer with first the Hidden Child Conference and then your work with OTC. So I think that's one of the gifts that you, Iris, have given, and it's certainly the gift that the two of you give to us. So I wanted to point that out.
It's a large tapestry.
I do see it so. Yes, yes. Jonathan asked about the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport, as Iris has said, and as you all may know, was an effort through which 10,000 children were brought from Greater Germany, meaning Germany and Austria, and then Czechoslovakia, into England. And the start of this, many people begin with the British government and its willingness to take the children. Some people begin the story with the Jewish community in England, which pressed the government to bring in the children. I begin the story with the parents who were prepared to send their children to an unknown place in the hope of sending them to safety, and to the Jewish communities in every town and city of Greater Germany, which made transplantation of children its greatest priority at that time. So the way that that too, this whole Kindertransport story is actually rather complicated. Number one, at that time, parents inscribed their children's names onto lists. There were over 60,000 names. So the first question is, whom to choose of that 60,000? Imagine these social workers in the Jewish community centers. Anyway, the social workers made up the lists of children whom they would suggest to the British government to take. Those lists were sent to Britain. Britain then sent them to the Home Office, to the refugee organization in Britain, went from there to the Home Office to get passes, not a proper passport, but just a pass. The pass was then flown, these passes were then flown by airplane to the continent, back to the Jewish community centers, from there to the Nazi authorities to stamp, and then with those stamped permissions to leave and to enter, the children were assembled in trains and the parents said goodbye and they left. That's a short summary of what was actually an incredibly arduous, complicated and emotionally fraught process. Note with this that everyone was actually willing in this case. In the American case, there was far less willingness. So complicate it by a factor of 1,000, and you've got the OTC.
May I just ask a question?
Sure.
The Kindertransport, what years was that concentrated in at the time?
Yes, so the Kindertransport was started 6 weeks, actually, after the Munich Agreement, and that was extremely important in this story. So it starts after the November pogrom of 1938 and goes straight through August of 1939. September 1st, 1939, Britain is in a state of war, and war closed the doors for Britain. That's not true of the United States. We didn't enter the war until end of 1941. So our doors were open for longer. And actually that leads to an incredible story in Marseille in the summer and fall, spring, summer, fall of 1941. And if you want, Jonathan, I'll go away with that. Otherwise, I'll zip it for now.
All right, very good.
Debórah, can I just follow up on that? I had read that part of the British decision to do the Kindertransport related to the fact that after Kristallnacht was also the time when the British already had basically closed Palestine to Jewish immigration through agreement with the Arabs. And so when there was an outrage over Kristallnacht, what the British did, some say, to deal almost with the guilt engendered by closing of Palestine, was to rescue the children.
There are two pieces. So the first is after the Arab uprisings in 1936, and then the British offered a certain number of permits. So that is usually seen as the equivalence. It certainly is a factor 2 years later. My own reading of the situation is that Chamberlain himself was embarrassed. Remember a time when politicians could actually be embarrassed?
Good point.
He was embarrassed because 6 weeks earlier he had given this speech. This is Munich, peace for our time, and this was clearly not peace. So, this is September 1938, Munich, peace for our time. November 1938 is the November pogrom. There were also some key actors in Parliament, including, for example, Philip Baker, who was experienced in these kinds of things and pressed for it. So it was a number of circumstances that came together that pressed and pushed, actually, Parliament to act in this way. There was no cap, by the way, of 10,000. It was as many children as could be brought. And it happened that Britain went to war in September. Otherwise, more transports would have occurred. So do I think that that the closing of Palestine was a factor? Certainly. But my own read is that it was peace for our time, which was the more immediate prompt.
I have just one observation, and then I want to ask a question. And the observation is a very sad one for us here at YIVO, because, of course, we concentrate more or less on Eastern Europe, the lands of Poland and Lithuania, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. And there were no rescue efforts for those children. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Yes.
Hello.
No, I take that back. These rescue efforts were not for those children. So why don't you describe what was in place for where, of course, the majority of Jews lived.
So no matter how many rescue efforts there were, there certainly were not enough. So that's the bottom line. But the reason why I responded as I did to Jonathan is because of the story, the maybe famous story for you, of the Tehran children. So fleeing the Germans, some 300,000 Polish Jews went into the Soviet Union. The Soviets then packed them up and sent them even farther east into the Asiatic republics and so on, and where most were
and to Siberia.
Sorry?
And to Siberia.
And to Siberia, where most were in labor camps. And so the situation went until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the Soviet Union then switched sides and became an ally. When the Soviet Union became an ally, it recognized the Polish citizenship and nationality of those Jews, as well as non-Jews, whom they had picked up and packed off. And they returned to the consular protection of their national government, which was Poland. So to make a long story short, the Soviet Union permitted the raising of an army in the Soviet Union, Polish army, the Anders Army, and they also permitted 24,000 people, members of that army and civilians, so 24,000 in total, to go from the Soviet Union into Iran, which by this point had been occupied by Britain and Russia. You're with me so far? Of these 24,000, 1,000 were unaccompanied children. And this was an effort by Zionist organizations to pull Jewish children from orphanages where they had been placed and to send them to Iran. And then in 1943, by 1943, some 850 of the 1,000 were taken from Tehran to Palestine. And that is why they are called the Tehran children.
Thank you, Debórah. That, too, is a very sad statement, but nevertheless. So, one last question, Iris. Describe the OTC archive. What's in it? Yeah, what's in the collection? And then we'll have questions from the floor.
Well, over the course of 7 years, we were asking OTC children and their families to donate whatever documents they would to us. Because we believe that in the end, that would be the legacy. And we do believe that the collection here at YIVO is, I personally believe, is OTC's real legacy long after we are all gone. What is really important about that collection is that it is filled with first-person accounts. So there are history books that tell us a whole lot about the Holocaust and etc., World War II. But I think that many people are most interested and get a perspective on the times from people who lived through it. And so we were very fortunate that many of the OTC children actually kept diaries and also were avid letter writers. So for parents and family that they could still communicate with, there were many letters. And there were diaries. We actually have a diary written actually on the ship from one of the children. Afterwards, many actually began to write their memoirs, and they're still writing them. Some have been published. Most have not been published, but we have copies of most of those. I think that just is a treasure trove for the public and academia of what it was really like from the point of view of the children themselves. But it's not just the children. Rescuers also wrote their memoirs and kept diaries. That is also there. It's filled also with all kinds of multimedia. There are videotapes, audio tapes, the 3-day conference at which there were 50 speakers, which included rescuers, OTC children, second generation, third generation, half a dozen scholars that had done original research. That entire conference was videotaped, and there is as well a written transcript, and that is all in the archives. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of photographs of people, places, and documents. Also, over the course of our research here at YIVO, there are no less than 10 other collections here at YIVO that have material relevant to this history. We plowed through many of them. And we also Xerox pages from those at 25 cents a page.
That's a discount.
Literally, probably 1,000 pages, which is also part of it so that you don't have to do that. Afterwards, OTC children published books. Their books are here. Their books of poetry are here. Something very important is, and I mentioned about the Harvard study. OTC, through a contract with Harvard that was doing a major study of children rescued during the Holocaust, had an agreement to include OTC children, and they actually included about 230. Each one of those people filled out a 16-page, double-sided, single-spaced questionnaire. They were also audio taped and some videotaped. All that data, the findings are actually in a book. The raw data is actually, by contract, owned by 1,000 children. That is now here. It is here for scholars, for PhD candidates, we hope, even for teachers who want to come and take a look at that kind of information. That is all here to be examined, and for more information to be found about the children. So it is a treasure trove of information for the OTC children themselves, for teachers who want to make it part of the curriculum on the Holocaust, which I hope that they will, and for researchers who want to delve more into this, not only with our collection, but the 10 others here at YIVO that are related to it.
Thank you very much. And now, before we go on to the question and answer, yes.
Relative to what she was just saying about the archives, there is a website, www.1000children.org, and most of what Iris just said is in that website, so you can look it up, get to it, and so on. It's still a little bit of a work in progress, but for the most part, almost all the documents, more or less, that you cited and so on, should be in there someplace if you want to look for it.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to invite all of the OTC children who are here with us today to please stand and be honored. Thank you all very much. We'll now move on to questions. All the way in the back. There's a microphone. Please wait for it.
I wish to extend a major yasher koach to all of the panel, to YIVO for sponsoring this, and to all of the participants in the front rows, the children, survivors. I have a question. I know, I assume that having been uprooted from your families and being placed in host families creates an element of psychological and emotional trauma in many cases. And I'd like to know, with your permission, if in this transport or prior to the transport, if faith and religious affiliation was a key factor in enabling you to overcome any psychological and emotional trauma. And also, my second question to you is, today we have in Israel, internally, children facing emotional and psychological trauma from rockets, from missiles. And it seems that unlike in the days during the Holocaust, where concerted efforts were made to rescue these children, internally, these children are being bombarded with rockets. They have physical, psychological, and emotional trauma. And are there concerted efforts by organizations to rescue them from this physical and emotional trauma?
Thank you. Eve?
In terms of religious affiliation, et cetera, I think my parents were pretty secular, and I didn't have any particular religious background. I mean, I knew very clearly I was Jewish. I have no idea how I knew that, because I was separated from them when I was 5. In terms of healing and dealing with trauma, prior to age 9, I was a very acting out, defiant, mischievous, difficult kid. And in trying to place me in foster homes, there was very little success. There was a wonderful foster home director in St. Louis who was in charge of one of the foster homes that I was in. Just one moment. Who said very clearly, this kid experienced trauma. She needs some help. So I was so fortunate to have almost 2 years of excellent psychotherapy, and it saved my life. It really saved my life. So as a psychotherapist, I can't tell you how important psychotherapy is, but on a personal level, I wouldn't be the kind of person that I was fortunate enough to become, because my attitude had been, you can't tell me what to do, you're not my mother. So I couldn't really assimilate into any of those foster homes. And I did well in group settings, and then I got married and developed my own family. So psychotherapy is a very important component of healing trauma.
Well, I guess I had a little different experience. For one thing, it's interesting, when I was asked to remember from Vienna and the boat trip and so on, I must admit I remembered very little. My memory really starts almost by the time I got to the Bronx with my aunt, and she had 2 children, 2 older daughters, and we got along very well. I don't recall any distinct trauma, except every now and then I was told that I was stubborn. I would wake up in the morning and decide I don't want to go to school that day, and they could do whatever they want. I didn't go. Although the 2 daughters of my aunt were basically my sisters, and while I called them cousins, to the day that they both passed away, they always introduced me to people as their brother. And people who knew different would sort of look at them, not me. But I don't recall any gross changes in my life. Maybe I was a little bit too young. Although the other thing I must say, I was requested to make a presentation at the 2002 reunion. And I didn't remember very much, but what I did do was write. I had about 25 or 30 names of the 50 children, and I wrote to them. There was no question. If they were single children that came, I got information. I got most information from older children and from children who came as siblings, a brother and sister, or two sisters. They remembered much more in 2002 from what went on in 1939 than I did, by far.
I am the son-in-law of a member of the OTC, although she never really knew about the organization because she died in 1992 after a lengthy illness, but her two brothers survived. They're here in the United States today. After my mother-in-law died, I started doing research based on everything that we found in her personal belongings, including her passport and a ticket aboard a ship called the Conte di Savoia. I went to the National Archives here in New York and found the ship's manifest. 10 years later, in 2003, my search on the internet led me here to the YIVO Institute to look at microfilms for the German Jewish Children's Aid. And with everything I collected, I learned that 4 weeks after my mother-in-law and her two brothers arrived, the Conte di Savoia returned, and a young man by the name of Heinz Frankel was aboard that ship, and he's here today. He's Henry Frankel. 2 or 3 years ago, I did a presentation in my men's club, and I talked about what I called the tale of 3 German Jewish children refugees. And a person in the audience came up to me. His name was Dennis Ross, and he said to me afterwards, "I was very moved by your presentation. Did you know that I am the nephew of Cecilia Brzozowski?" Really? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the family changed the name.
Are you talking about the Dennis Ross?
Not the one, or maybe it's David Ross, not the person in Washington, D.C. Okay, my question is this. I am not... I'm an actuary by trade. I'm the son of a genealogist. My father was the president of the Michigan Jewish Genealogical Society. Under his tutelage, I put everything together. I would like to donate what I collected to the archives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I would like to ask the children, or perhaps some of the children in the audience who haven't spoken, what their memory was of how their parents presented this situation to them. They're being told that they have to leave home. Perhaps they're being told that they're never going to see their parents again. They may or may not have had a Jewish identity. So I would be very interested, and as I say, maybe some of the people who are seated might want to respond. How in the world did your parents present this situation to you?
Jonathan just pointed to me. I was 5. I really don't remember, but I do remember seeing the film Into the Arms of Strangers, which was your inspiration. And I do remember when my daughter turned 7, the last time I saw my parents was on the dock in Marseille saying goodbye. I don't remember having anybody ever presented to me that I was, well, I knew that I was leaving. I knew on a gut level that this was the last time I was going to see my parents. But on my daughter's 7th birthday, it really hit me. And I thought, how in the world was it possible for my mother? My father had something to do with it, but they were separated. They were in separate camps. And I do remember my mother working with social workers and signing papers or telling me something. And I do remember her teaching me, maybe 6, 7 words: hello, goodbye, good morning, good night, thank you, please. So that was my preparation. I have no idea how, as an adult, at that time, she experienced it. I know how I experienced it as a mother of a 7-year-old. I don't know how parents do it, but if you have to save your kid, you do what you got to do.
Well, I don't really remember, but I told you I wrote to the children, and I got some of their quotes here relative to what you said. All I knew was that my parents told me I was going with my sister on a big ship on a long trip. When I cried about learning that they were not to come along, I wanted to know why. They said there was no room on the ship, and I remember pleading that they could attach a rope to the ship and be pulled along behind it. And you talked about psychiatry. Another quote from one of the letters that I got. This experience and pressure that my life depended upon my filling out, copying my school records with no erasures allowed, the cost of paper to us, and getting all the right answers have left me scarred for the rest of my life. To this day, I cannot fill out a form of any sort without breaking out into a sweat.
I'm afraid we have time only for one more question.
Jonathan, we have it.
Okay.
Well, I think actually a big mistake was made in my case because I was told that it was up to me, that I had to make the decision. And I was 10 years old. And they, the Krauses said, well, no, we don't want to take anybody who isn't volunteering herself. And later on, when I met some of the other people, I realized they were way too young to have made the decision. They couldn't have been asked. I was never the same after that. I was never the same, not because I decided to go, but because I had no decision to make. The minute that I knew that I could go, I was going. And I knew I was leaving my parents and my sister in great danger, and I was saving my own goddamn neck and leaving them. And I never got over that. Never. That has ruined my entire life.
It's hard to have another question, but excuse me? Oh, Henry, wish to say something?
I just want to give my answer to the question that arose before. At 3 o'clock in the morning, we received a knock on the door. It was the SS, and they took us to the train station and deported us to Poland, where we experienced a very rough winter, one of the hardest winters. I had earaches and so forth. Luckily, we got back to Germany, and I made it onto the list of the German Jewish Children's Aid. But in my case, there was no question of what we had tasted of the dark, and my parents were eager to send me, but like all women, German women, they said, I love you for taking them, I hate you for taking them. It was a mixed emotion.
One more, yeah?
One more.
I'm here with my father today, and first I'd like to say thank you for the 1,000 Children Organization, the Center for Jewish History, YIVO, and Gunnar, who about 4 or 5 years ago helped me bring my father, as he said it, to put his life together and answer a lot of questions that he didn't know. But I think the answer to The question that was just asked, my father does not remember a lot of the circumstances before he came, but thanks to the information we found, his file that was located just minutes away from where I lived, he was promised the world from his family. That his parents said, "You're going to go to America, and you're going to live in a big house, and your cousins and my sister and the wonderful people of America are going to embrace you, and you're going to have everything you've ever wanted." And my father came over, and within a few years was in 14 foster homes. And as the social worker said, through no fault of his own, we've exhausted all options for Heinz, Harry. And that was his experience. But he made the most of it, and I'm very proud of him. So.
Well, I think it's, if I could just say one thing in summary, I think it's a story of tremendous bravery, of tremendous courage and sadness, but also something to celebrate, that we're all here, and there are families, and there's continuation. So, does anyone have a last comment?
Who would like to have?
Oh, okay, one last comment.
I'm giving you my time. I really appreciate it because my name is Rosemary Siebert, and I have written a book called Forced Journey, the Saga of Werner Berlinger. And I've made a huge effort in this book to convey the feelings of the children who had to make those choices. I mean, I read the accounts very carefully, and even though it is a fictional book, and the people. Thank you, ma'am. If you would be so kind, it was the lady behind you who also was wanting to speak. Yes.
I was a hidden child in France, in a convent.
Can you all hear?
I was a hidden child in France, in a convent. My little brother went to Spain with the Quakers. The reason I'm telling the story is that we knew we were in danger. We had to do what our parents told us to do. When they told us, you have to go with this lady or with this gentleman, we just went. We just hoped that they would follow sooner or later. But there was no way that we would fight this and say, no, Ma, I want to stay with you. We had to go to save our lives and their lives as well, because people, a family together, could not go into hiding, almost impossible to stay together. I was lucky enough to keep my parents and to be reunited with my brother 5 years later.
Thank you very much.
Jonathan, can I just say
Sure.
how very grateful I am, and my family is, for the fact that YIVO is the recipient of these archives, because I think they're very important. It's so easy for all of it to get lost. I thank you for doing the enormous amount of research, enormous, and I really want to thank Henry Frankel for continuing this after Iris and Lenore had to resign and pass on the baton. It's really important. The work that you've done is really important, and the work that you are archiving is important. It's part of the big tapestry. So thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. We will have about 15 minutes. Please come back, and we will then be introduced to the film. Thank you very much. I have two introductions to make. The first is to that gentleman who is walking up the left side of the theater and about to take his seat. And that is Gunnar Berg, who is the archivist in charge of HIAS material here at YIVO, and also the archivist now beloved by the OTC organization, who has husbanded this project from beginning to end. So thank you, Gunnar, for all your hard work. And the next introduction is of Evan List. And Evan is a member of the YIVO Next Generation committee organization. He is one of the founding members of it. And without Evan, we would not have been able to put this project together, this afternoon together. So I thank you very much, Evan, for your work and that of your wife, Kate. And Evan is also vice president of Alliance Bernstein, which we are very grateful is sponsoring the reception of this program. Evan.
Thank you all so much. I will keep my remarks very, very brief. As Jonathan mentioned a few months ago, I had the honor of inviting some of the YIVO staff to a screening of the film that you're going to watch in a few minutes that Alliance Bernstein was hosting. And at that screening, by the way, our CEO, the Alliance Bernstein CEO, is the grandson of Eleanor and Gilbert Kraus, which the story is about today. So at that screening, I was informed of the larger story that is the 1,000 children. And it is only natural that we dovetail the conversation, the larger story of the 1,000 children, with the story that we're going to tell today, that of the 50 children, the rescue mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the filmmaker, independent filmmaker Stephen Pressman. Stephen Pressman was born in Los Angeles and received an undergraduate degree from the University of California in Berkeley. And he spent many years as a reporter and editor, working for publications in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, where he now lives. And 50 Children, the rescue mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus, is Stephen's first film, and it first premiered on HBO in April. So without further ado, please welcome Stephen Pressman.
Thank you very much. I'm a little shorter than Evan, so the sight lines have to change. It's an honor to be here at YIVO. It's certainly an honor to be part of this great program today. I want to thank everybody here for putting this together, and certainly for inviting me and presenting this terrific opportunity to show the film here, which, as Evan mentioned, is in effect a subset of the 1,000 children. I'm going to let the film, which runs just a little over an hour, so you just have a sense of the timing. I'm going to pretty much let the film speak for itself, but just by way of introducing my own connection to this otherwise essentially hidden Holocaust rescue story. A little over 13 years ago, as Evan mentioned, I live in San Francisco. A little more than 13 years ago, I met a woman named Liz Purley, who also lived in San Francisco. I had a daughter, she had a son. We met a little more than 12 years ago. Liz and I got married. And somewhere in that period of meeting Liz and marrying Liz, she one day said, "There's something I'd like to show you." And she went upstairs to her little office and pulled out from a desk drawer a stack of papers, which she kept in a file in a drawer that was filled with very exciting things like bank records and medical bills and tuition bills and exciting things like that. And she handed me a stack of typewritten pages on onion skin paper. Now, I think all of us in this room are old enough to know what onion skin paper is. But if there's anyone who's too young to remember, ask the person next to you, and they'll tell you what onion skin is. And what Liz showed me was stunning to me, but not stunning to Liz. She showed me a typewritten stack of about 170 pages that was written by her grandmother, Eleanor Kraus. Eleanor had written, some years after this story takes place, an account of what she and her husband Gil, both of them from Philadelphia, had done in the spring of 1939. I thought I was reading a novel. I thought I was reading a piece of fiction. This was a story that my wife always knew about her grandparents, but not because they spoke about it, because they rarely spoke about what they had done in the spring of 1939. To make a long story short, at the time, I did nothing about this. I was working as a journalist. We both had our jobs and our kids to raise. But a few years ago, I went back to that manuscript, and I thought, this is just too good a story to remain hidden, as it were, in plain sight. And I came up with this notion, somewhat born out of naivete, somewhat born out of good Jewish hubris, to do something I had never done before, and that was to make a documentary film that I'm now very privileged to share with you. So that, in short order, is the genesis of this film. I hope you enjoy it. I look forward to hearing some of your questions after the film, and thanks again for inviting me.
Many thanks to Stephen Pressman for this really amazing film. Many thanks to Evan for bringing it here. The program is going to continue with Mr. Pressman's taking some questions, and then there will be some awards handed out by the OTC organization.
Thank you very much. I'm eager to, thank you for that reception. I'm eager to hear your questions. I just wanted to acknowledge two folks in the audience. You met Erwin Tepper earlier on the panel, one of the rescue children who does show up as a 10-year-old or so a couple of times in the film, and also my dear friend Henny Winkart, who is also in the film, both today and then. I want to thank both of them, as well as several others among the children and their families, for providing me with photographs and documents and a lot of the archival materials that you see in the film. So my gratitude to them. And with that, we've got a mic here, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Wow, I left you speechless. That's good. Yes. Sure. The question was about the foster families and how they were recruited. You know, unfortunately, in researching the story, to a certain extent, for me at least, as a journalist and a researcher in putting together this film, the story sort of ended when the children arrived. I did as much as I could to sort of track their whereabouts afterward. I was not able to account for all 50 and precisely what happened. I do know that a good number, perhaps even a majority of the 50 children, already had relatives, near or not so near, in terms of immediate family, living in the States. And whenever possible, many of the children, after the summer they spent at the Bris Shalom camp in Collegeville, went to live with those relatives. There were certainly some of the children who were sent, at least temporarily, to live with foster families. I heard from one or two, similar to the comment that was made earlier, that some of those situations were not the most positive. Others who had foster family experiences, Kurt Herman, who appears in the film, had a wonderful foster family in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I should add that Gil Kraus, who spent weeks and weeks that summer essentially helping to place the children, insisted that none of these children be legally adopted, certainly by anyone other than blood relatives. He was quite sure, as you could tell, he was a confident, cocksure kind of guy. He was actually quite sure that many of the parents would ultimately be reunited with their children. Within a year of this story, about a third of the parents had come over, and several others did manage to get out even later. So he made sure that none of these children would be legally adopted, but certainly a handful of them at least did spend some time with foster families. How those families were selected were primarily through the Bris Shalom organization. I know that there were social workers involved in helping to match children up with families. Some of the affidavits that Eleanor Kraus had obtained as sponsors themselves offered to take in one or two of the children, at least temporarily.
Was there any further reaction from the Jewish community as this project became successful?
There was some controversy about the response from the Jewish community. As the film fairly briefly refers to, Gil Kraus was strongly urged to, as it were, stand down from this operation for a variety of reasons. Interestingly enough, one of the Philadelphia Jewish officials who tried his best to talk Gil out of this, a couple of weeks after the children arrived, the Brit Shalom organization had its annual convention at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City. And that same gentleman from Philadelphia showed up and gave a speech lauding Brit Shalom for succeeding in doing what it had done. Understandable reasons for some of the resistance, for a variety of reasons that was even addressed earlier, the kind of anti-Semitism, the fear of a backlash, the fact that there were other organizations, as we've heard earlier, that were actively doing the same kinds of things with mixed results. I think there were some concerns that here was, in a sense, a bit of a rogue operation. And I think that helps to explain a lot of the organized resistance. Afterward, of course, people were gratified and grateful that they had succeeded. I should add briefly that Brit Shalom, like some of these other organizations, was very intent on repeating this very same mission. But unfortunately, the war broke out a couple of months later, and that, along with the other rescue efforts that had been discussed earlier, pretty much came to a halt at that point. Anything else? Yes, in the back.
First of all, thank you for a beautiful film about something most of us never heard of.
Me too.
My understanding from the film, the Krauses are Jewish, yes?
Correct.
So the fact that they were American and wealthy was enough to protect them from, there was something there about, that their room was searched and all that, but they didn't have to wear a Jewish star, and they weren't, I'm a little confused about the fact that somehow all these horrible things were happening to the Jews that lived there, and yet these Americans just sort of walked in and were in elegant cafes in a great hotel doing something fabulous. Sure. But they were protected from these laws because they were American?
Well, the short answer is absolutely yes. This was a period in time in the first 6 months of 1939 when the U.S. and Nazi Germany still technically recognized each other diplomatically. In fact, our ambassador had been recalled back to Washington by President Roosevelt immediately after Kristallnacht. So full diplomatic relations were ruptured. But we still had an embassy, and as the film points out, it was perfectly legal for Americans, if they wished, to travel into and out of Nazi Germany. So the fact that Gil and Eleanor were Jews, and I might add, we're talking about very, very secular Jews, but nonetheless, they were Jewish, and that clearly was known to the Gestapo and to the Nazi authorities in both Berlin and Vienna. But yes, there was nominal protection, not because they had money, but because they were Americans with American passports. Now, there are examples earlier than this, earlier in the Nazi regime, of American businessmen and tourists and others being roughed up and arrested for a variety of reasons. So there was certainly an element of risk. But in terms of the same Nazi anti-Jewish laws, those would not have technically applied to Americans, Jewish or otherwise. It's a good question. I think right here.
Who paid for the passage?
Who paid for the passage?
Of those children and their upkeep during their time here. Also, I'd like to mention the star was not worn in 1939 in Europe as well. It came afterwards.
That's correct. The fees for the expenses for the operation, including the passage on the SS Harding and the upkeep at the summer camp was all picked up by the Brit Shalom fraternal organization. Gil's father, a real estate guy in Philadelphia named Solomon Kraus, had been one of the original founding members of that organization way back in 1905. Gil himself was a very active member of the Brit Shalom organization, which was, at least at the time, roughly comparable to B'nai B'rith. They had lodges around the country, primarily here on the East Coast, and that organization raised the money. I have no doubt that Gil and Ella themselves paid their own way. I know that Dr. Schless paid his own way. But in terms of the expenses for the children, that would have been picked up by the Brit Shalom organization. Do we have time for one or two more? Yeah, way in the back. This will be the last question, so make it a really good one.
Actually, it's just more of a quick statement because I grew up in Philadelphia, as I just told Steve before the film. I grew up in Philadelphia. My father belonged to the Sol C. Kraus Lodge. We grew up knowing Brit Shalom, knowing Kraus. I got a Kraus scholarship to college, yet we never had the slightest hint in my entire life until 6 months ago that this had happened. So talk about being humble and unassuming. Gil Kraus, and maybe for political reasons as well, they kept it quiet and they didn't trumpet it until now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
One last bit of business is that there are some awards given out by OTC, and Erwin Tepper will do that.
Thank you. I'll just take a few minutes to present some awards to the three people who have, in my opinion, and I think in everyone else's opinion, contributed the most to the OTC organization and to this meeting. So without any further ado, I would like to present some plaques of appreciation that we made up, and I'll just read one of them. They're all more or less the same. The board and members of OTC 1000 Children present this token of appreciation to Iris Posner, President 2000 to 2007. In recognition of your outstanding achievement in conception, creation, and leadership of the organization. Not very good poetry, but you get the general idea. And the most important part is on the bottom. Thank you. And a similar plaque for Lenore, again for her contribution. And certainly not least to Henry Frankel for his takeover and all his contributions. So again, thank you very much, and have a good future, all of you.
There is a reception outside. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Oh, excuse me. One last word from Iris Posner.
On September 10th, 1941, a multi-denominational gathering dined at the Waldorf Astoria. The event was an effort to raise $500,000, including $145,000, to care for rescued children already in the United States, and $360,000 to rescue 600 more children facing imminent danger in southern France. It's not in today's dollars either. On the dais were Eddie Cantor, Marshall Field, Archibald McLeish, James Paul Warburg, Stanley Isaacs, Eric Biddle, Clarence Pickett of the Quakers, Maurice Troper from The Joint, and Fiorello LaGuardia. The audience included Stephen Wise, Joseph Revson, David Sulzberger, the Warburg family, Newbold Morris, Lottie Marcuse, Fred Hirschhorn, and Mr. and Mrs. Frank Furstenberg, and Solomon Lowenstein. All these names, especially those from New York, I know you know these names. And several hundred more cited in Who's Who in America. This myriad of connections and communications between Child Rescue Network participants, which are contained and documented in at least 11 collections in the archives of YIVO, including the newly added OTC collection, are a treasure trove of information. On behalf of the 1,000 children, their families, and rescuers, I want to thank YIVO for providing a home and committing to the care of the OTC collection. Its accessibility to the public, scholars, researchers, teachers, students, and the OTC family is, in my opinion, the most important part of the OTC legacy. Lenore and I want to add our personal thanks to all the OTC children and their families who shared and entrusted their life stories with us. Knowing them has enriched our lives, and we are deeply grateful for their continued friendship. A special thanks to Henry Frankel and the board for continuing to care for and nurture OTC and arranging for its final home at YIVO. We'd also like to thank Professor Judith Baumel-Schwartz, without whose seminal work on this history and personal support, we would not be here today. Lastly, my most heartfelt thanks to Lenore, without whose support in every way OTC could not have succeeded. Thank you.